that was snazzy.
Right. We promised a new intro, and there it is. How exciting for us and how exciting for everybody listening. Welcome back to another episode of the Pax What She Said podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Maggie Loney, joined as always by Perry Goldstein. And this is fun. How exciting it is to be back at She Said TV. We get cool intros, cool overlays on our videos. If you're watching on YouTube, like they spoil us over there, the guys at She Said TV. They really take good care of us. Perry, how are you doing?
I'm great. That actually put me in such a good mood. Wow, I love that. They really do. This has been so fun and exciting. It feels so good to be back. I hope everyone enjoyed that little tune.
Yeah, so this week, contracts are still kind of the hotbed discussion. We saw Trevor Lawrence just, get some money. So now we're looking at Jordan Love's contract pending, but there are a ton of other names on the roster. Kenny Clark is in contract talks. There's plenty of guys whose contracts will end after the 2024 season. So it's going to be the topic of discussion today is, starting with Jordan Love. You said it pre-show, and I think the words are perfect. He is the linchpin, right? Like once that domino falls, the rest of these dominoes can fall into place. Kenny Clark has said he wants to stay in Green Bay. So let's talk about all of it, starting with Jordan. Do you think it gets done before training camp?
I do.
Same.
I do. So before we dive in, I have a general commentary before we dive into the Jordan discussion, because you said it. It's the hot topic. And I want to say that this is not going to be an anxious freak out show. The point of this discussion is that there are some big names that are looking to get paid. Obviously, the quarterback is one of them. And I think it's just a really interesting conversation to be had pre-training camp, because I think some of these guys are going to get paid before training camp. I think some of these guys could get paid before the season. And I think some of these guys won't get paid until after the season. And I think that's really why we want to have this conversation. Looking at when and if they will. Some of it will depend on play on the field. Some of it will depend on other guys' contracts. And I think it's just fun to look at right now as we kind of wait for everyone to come back from their mini break to go to training camp. So with that said, this is a very positive, exciting contract show. And yes, I do think Jordan Love gets his contract done. I have a feeling it's nearly there, given how calm everybody seems talking about it. Jordan is currently in Italy with his girlfriend.
Having the time of their lives.
Does not seem bothered one bit. Goot came on Packers Transplants with our founding fathers, Nagler and Corey. If you didn't listen to the show, it was great. And even said, fully expect it to get done before then. Everybody is in on it. They want the same things. But I do think, aside from timing, the numbers and the way it's structured is going to impact, notably, I think, Kenny more than anybody else. But in general, it's going to impact not just the 2025 free agents, but all the other free agents that are coming down the pike. Right now, they have a very cheap offense. Everyone's on their rookie deal, but Jordan's contract is going to change that, because eventually they are going to have to pay those guys, and Jordan's contract will be on the books. So I'm really curious to see how they do it, because I'm sure that Goot and Russ Ball are thinking that far ahead.
Right. I was going to say, thankfully, that's a conversation that we don't have to have until next offseason, because we know that like Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, a lot of these guys are going to come up at the same time. And given what we expect Jordan Love's contract to cost, probably unlikely that they're going to be able to retain all of their talent. So that's why, when you're talking about like a win now window, I don't think it's that severe for Green Bay, but you do want to try to win when you have these cheap contracts. And I think the Bengals are a really good example of that, right? Joe Burrow, they had Jamar Chase still under his rookie deal, T. Higgins, like that was a really young core on offense, got all the way to the Super Bowl, didn't win the trophy, and now they're having to pay a lot of their star players. So I think the Packers are kind of in a similar situation where they're about to pay their quarterback, deservedly so, a lot of money, and that's going to affect where they're able to bring in players. And I think that's why the draft that they had this last season was so smart, right? With Marshawn Lloyd. 2 years ago, they brought in their tight ends. So they've kind of staggered their positions, right? So every couple of years, you have maybe a big decision to make, but you're only making really one big decision on at least the offensive side of the ball every couple of years now. And it's not like all of your players are due their contracts at one time. So looking at the market, the quarterback market, we saw Trevor Lawrence, like we said, just got paid. I always forget Patrick Mahomes was on a 10-year deal. But what are you kind of thinking as far as value-wise? We know Patrick Mahomes is averaging $45 million a year because of that longevity of that. Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence at 55, Justin Herbert at 52.5, Lamar Jackson at 52, and then Josh Allen's at 43, Jalen Hurts at 51. So what kind of, where do you put him, I guess, in the quarterback tier?
I was going to ask you this. So beat me to it. It's interesting because every time a quarterback gets paid, I feel like they reset the market, whether it's deserved or not, right? So you just said it, like Josh Allen's the lowest paid of all those guys. I think he should be paid more than like a Trevor Lawrence, right? He certainly has the better track record at this point, but it's pretty much whoever gets paid most recently is now getting paid the most. I don't know if Jordan is going to get that level of a contract. The Packers definitely get creative in what they do. I can't see it, and I want your thoughts. I can't see it being like a very cookie cutter, 55 mil over 4 years. That's it, right? I would be surprised if they did something like that, especially after essentially really only seeing Jordan for half a season. I think everybody believes, fans, everybody in the building believes that's who Jordan is. That's who we're going to get. And again, you pay a guy, you give them a contract based on a projection who they think he's going to be in the future. And they believe he's going to be the guy in the future. But it's still based off of, really one season or half a season of exceptional play. I think it's going to be heavy on the signing bonus, heavy on the incentives, like they did for his most recent extension that they gave him in lieu of his 5th-year option. I do think it'll be, if Jordan's agents are good at their job, which they are, and have a really good track record of getting their clients great contracts, it's going to be upwards of 50. And I think he deserves that. I just don't know if it's going to look like what Trevor Lawrence just got.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I'm not, Ken Ingalls. I'm not the contract person. I don't know these kinds of numbers, but I do think that it'll be heavy in like the escalators, like you mentioned, the incentives. And I think kind of, if we're talking about, the Packers MO as of recent, it's probably going to be a back-laden deal. Like, even if they did like 6 years, and then the money, and then they just set themselves up for, we're planning on restructuring in 3 years, and then we'll extend you at that time. But we're going to call this like a 5 or 6 year deal just to spread the money out on our books. Like, so I agree with you. I don't think that it's going to be like, the Jared Goff $53 million a year that he just signed this offseason. Like, I think Jordan's going to get paid, and I think it'll be 50 mil, if not a little bit more than that, just to keep it competitive, because, they also need to keep him happy, right? Yeah. And he took a team-friendly deal, bet on himself, and that paid out for him, obviously. But yeah, I think this is the time now where he's going to expect the dividends that he put in. Like, all right, now it's time to pay up here. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very incentive driven deal, and I do think it's going to set them up for a restructure in like 2 or 3 years.
Interesting. 6 years is interesting. That would be a long contract. I'm expecting 4, but 6 is interesting because, like we just said, they are looking ahead at all the other guys they have to pay, and I think spreading money out makes sense in terms of like cap hits.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if it would be something like the Josh Jacobs contract, where it's written as 4 years, but everybody knows, like, or it's written like 2 years, but there's like a 1 year. So this would be like, it's written as 4 years and there's a 2 year kind of revision. I just think that the Packers aren't going to do something that locks them in. Well, you said it already. Like, we already think Jordan's the guy. He's betting on himself. The front office is willing to pay him and is betting that he is the guy. But I also don't think they're going to put themselves in a corner either where they can't get out of something. So I think how they write the contract is going to be really creative, and we'll see the numbers, and then, what the fine print I think is going to look different than the original numbers.
Yeah. I actually don't know if I agree with that.
Oh, really?
I can't imagine Jordan and his agent not signing something that's binding for at least like 3 to 4 years. Like, I'd be shocked if what he signed on paper didn't at least lock him in for 3 seasons, like at minimum. I could see it being, like you just said, like a longer contract, but they can get out of it soon, but like get out of it at 3 or 4 seasons. Not 2. 2 is so short.
I know. I'm just trying to think of like how they could structure a deal for both parties. Like, if you're talking about incentives, like playoffs would definitely be in there, and then he could earn more money that way. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I do think that I think 6 years is a pretty intriguing idea, but then again, I'm not a paid NFL agent, so that's
It is a really intriguing
thing that I'm
idea.
saying with.
You also have to look at what their cap hits look like in 2025, right? Because Jair has a almost $26 million cap hit. Rashawn has a $25.5 million cap hit. Elton's jumps up to 17.5. So does Xavier McKinney. So does Preston Smith. And then we're going to talk about Kenny, but Kenny hits nearly 14 million. So they've got some like heavy hitters. Now, naturally, all of those guys are there. Those are their stars, essentially. So you have to expect it. And one of those guys is likely at least going to get a restructure, if not a new deal in and of itself. And they've been known to restructure deals, left and right when it comes to like freeing up space. But Jordan's deal is going to jump to the top of that list, I imagine, in terms of the cap hit as soon as he signs it. So where does that leave them? How much space are they going to need? Do they want to play around in free agency again, like they were able to do this season, and allow this team to be competitive again, even while they're paying their quarterback? Obviously needing space to sign their rookies. Like, these are all questions that I'm sure that they're contemplating while they're negotiating this. But it's funny because after that Kenny Clark hit, they have Josh Jacobs at 11, and then everyone is under 10, like their entire offense.
Yeah.
After Josh Jacobs is, God, I have to scroll. Actually, guess who the next highest cap hit is in 2025 on the offense? You're not going to guess this. It's so wild.
Zach Tom.
Jordan Morgan.
I guess, yeah, as a rookie, that would make sense. The market value is. Well, and that's what I was going to say with Jordan. Aaron Rodgers had always advocated like to bring NBA style contracts into the NFL and say, instead of saying, a quarterback gets $50 million a year, what if it becomes X percentage of the cap? Because as the cap grows, then you're able to offer more and not be locked into a specific number. And I don't know, if we would see that kind of contract, but it is a really intriguing thought to say like, hey, instead of committing Jordan to $55 million a year, we're going to give him, God, I don't even know what that would be, 40% of the cap over the next 5 seasons. And then you look at the way the cap grows, he might end up making like $65 billion a year. Like, and then, the market value for that position can reset as many times as it wants, but you're only committing to a percentage and not a number.
It is a really interesting idea. I would be intrigued to see how that would work. And if only doing it for quarterbacks, how that would impact other players.
Yeah.
Right now they have like SpaTrack has cap hit percentages just like on the website. And like, for example, Jair being the highest cap hit, he's about 9.5% of the cap.
Okay, so 40% was way off.
Yeah,
that's why I was not a math
major. So it would be probably maybe 20%. 15. Yeah. But they right now the Packers are projected to have about 60 mil in cap space next year. So you have to expect that Jordan takes up
at least half.
A large part of that. And then they have room. Any other thoughts on his contract?
Not really. I mean, I think that we talked about last season when it happened and he did the kind of restructure. It wasn't like the 50-year option. He had bet on himself instead. The Packers did, like a team-friendly thing, and they met in the middle. I thought that worked out really well for both parties. And we talked about it on the show, saying that, it was a way for Jordan to prove his worth, and also, understanding that if it hit, he was going to make a bag, which he's now going to do. And the Packers were able to say, hey, we want to reward you for all these incentives, but if it doesn't work, we have an out. So
yeah,
it's just, now we're hitting the point where pen's going to meet paper. And I'm really curious to see, where it ends up.
My only other thought is I'm curious if because he technically is on like the last year of his deal, right? In 2024, I put in quotes. If they kind of rip up what he's on and start anew, or if it's like an extension for whenever he signs it, if they tack it on. That's my only thought process there. If it's just like brand new, but it's neither here nor there. It's going to be monstrous either way. Right now, going with your percentages, he's in 2025. Let's say if he didn't sign a deal for 2025, he would be at 1.9% of the cap hit. So, they have him at 5.2 mil. He would have a signing bonus. Again, this is if they do not sign a deal, which we know that they're going to. His signing bonus for 2025 would be 1.75 mil.
Well, I was going to say the very basic exercise there, right? If he's at 5.2 mil, is just multiply it by 10. Then you're at like 12% of the cap and you're at 52 mil. And that could be, about what we're looking at. So,
yeah. But like I said, we said at the beginning, like he is really I think the catalyst for what they do with everyone else, because I mean, this is not exactly, but the same type of situation that happened when the Packers were waiting to potentially pay Devontae and they needed to pay Rodgers. Like Rodgers has to come first. Quarterback has to come first before they pay anybody else. And Kenny is next man up. He recently in a press conference was asked about it. And, obviously he said he'd love to stay in Green Bay. He would love to end his career in Green Bay. I don't know what else he was supposed to say in that situation. But I think Kenny is a really, really, really interesting case study, because especially for the Packers, because the Packers typically don't do third contracts. It's just like historically not something that they do. But Kenny is not your typical third contract guy for a number of reasons, right? One is he's still so young. I'm pretty sure he's younger than me.
He is 28, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, he's 28. He'll turn 29 during the season. So again, third contract guys are usually at least 30, if not older than that. So he's got 2 full years, 2 full seasons ahead of most third contract guys, which is significant in the NFL. That's basically almost an entire contract. And he's had, knock on wood, a very healthy career thus far. Like he does not have the same wear and tear as other third contract guys. He's still playing at an extremely high level, still viewed as one of the best nose tackles in the league. So this might be the exception to the rule that they make. Again, Goot was asked about it when he was on Transplants, and he kind of parroted the same thing. It wasn't as gung-ho necessarily as he is with other guys, but I do think if a deal is there, Kenny will be back.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, by the same logic that we were looking at quarterback contracts, if you look at like the defensive tackle market on Spot Track, and you could argue, whatever position you want to call him at, Spot Track has him labeled as a defensive tackle. And some of his contemporaries here, you could argue is getting paid under his value at 17,500 or 17 million a year. He's 14th based on their ranking for average salary. Chris Jones at 29 when he signed his contract, it was a 5-year deal, over 31 mil a year. Christian Wilkins, 28 when he signed his deal, it was a 4-year deal, 27.5 million. Justin Madubuike, obviously very recently signed his signing, 24.5 million a year. And then other guys like Quinnen Williams, Derek Brown, Jeffrey Simmons, DeForest Buckner, Deron Payne, Dexter Lawrence, Javon Hargrave, Christian Barrymore, Jonathan Allen, Vita Vea, and then Kenny Clark is all the way down there at 14th. And I don't think that there are 14 better defensive tackles in the league than Kenny Clark.
No,
so
definitely not.
So when you look at what he's actually getting paid, the Packers might have to almost overspend to keep him, amidst the contemporaries and give him the kind of money that he deserves. And that's where I think there could be a sticking point for that third contract, because some of these guys, I mean, Chris Jones is the best example, at 29, signed a 5-year extension. Kenny's younger, and however you rank some of these top 5-ish tackles, Aaron Donald, obviously retiring kind of resets that little bit of the market. But yeah, Kenny's better than a lot of these guys that are making significantly more money a year. And that was about 8.8% of the Packers cap.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think what they will have to do is make the contract less years. Like, the chances that Kenny Clark is signing a 5-year deal at likely, let's say they do it mid-season, he's 29 years old, very low. I mean, just probably a 0% chance. But a 3-year deal, sure. And especially if he goes out there and is playing at a high level with the help that they've given him on the defensive line, if he has the numbers that we expect him to, because he's playing 85% of snaps instead of 95% of snaps, and that also helps with his perceived longevity, I can see it happening. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm higher on Kenny Clark than most, but the idea of giving him 20 mil for 3 years does not seem like an overpay to me, based
Absolutely
on
not.
his play on the field.
He just had his best statistical season of his career. And I think he's only going to get better when you look at the jumps we expect from Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, Colby Wooden. And I don't necessarily think that those players being on the roster should have anything to do with whether or not they want to pay Kenny. I know that, it was Peter Bukowski was joking that we have Kenny Clark at home. And as much, if Carl Brooks turns out to be the second coming of Kenny Clark, great. I would rather have 2 Kenny Clarks on my roster than 1. I don't see the problem when the defensive line has been such an issue for so many years. It feels like you'd be taking, one step backward to finally have a cohesive unit and then get rid of your star on it. I think the Packers would have to be really careful with how they navigate that room, because even with the players they have now, we talked about how there may be 1 or 2 injuries away from a bare cupboard. And if you lose the star of the show, then you're half of an injury away, or a couple games are moved from a big problem.
And we've seen not this specific room, because they're finally, I think, at a place where they're full and at their potential best. And I say potential, keyword potential, because we haven't seen what they can do yet, but we've seen what the defensive front looks like without Kenny in. Again, he doesn't miss many games, but when he does, it's noticeable. And I agree with you. There's been some discussion around, if Devontae Wyatt has the season that we think he's going to have, or if TJ Slayton makes a jump this season, then is it worth bringing Kenny back? Yes. Yes. The answer is yes. He's so overlooked consistently. And you said it, he's coming off his best statistical season. He had 8 sacks last season?
7.5. Yeah.
7.5. And even if they do, let's keep this at 20 mil, just to keep it even, that's still he would not come into the market as the highest paid defensive tackle. He'd be,
not by a lot.
No, not even close. That would be, quite frankly, a quote unquote team friendly deal.
He'd be like 11th.
Yeah.
So he'd go up from 14th to 11th, still outside of the top 10.
Exactly. And I don't even know if he'd be willing to do that unless,
Right.
again, he wants to stay in Green Bay and he wants to retire in Green Bay and wants to, again, take a quote unquote team friendly deal. Because let's be honest, that's a team friendly deal. And I think there's a way to get a cap hit down, give him, once again, a larger signing bonus, like back end money, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen the Packers do this, add a fake year onto the end, whatever it is they want to do, especially if this is his last contract, he's going to retire. There are many ways. Do the Packers do this kind of contract? No. That's what I go back to is no. But if he goes out there and he balls out like we expect him to, I'd be hard pressed to see them letting him walk. Because someone else is going
probably
to pay.
The Bears. Historically, probably the Bears and the Vikings.
Like you said, like someone else is going to pay him. That is a guarantee.
Oh yeah. And so just, for comparison's sake, because we're talking about third contracts, I pulled up Preston Smith contract because I thought that was like a really interesting example because you said the Packers don't historically give out third contracts. So obviously drafted in 2015, signed with the Packers as a free agent from 2019 to 2022. That was a 4-year deal for $52 million. And then in 2023, at the age of 30, he signed another 4-year extension to keep him locked into Green Bay until the end of 2026. So by that time, in 2027, he'll be a free agent at 35 years old. So going back to your point about Kenny being 28, he could sign another 4-year deal and be 32, 33 when the contract ends.
And he could still be playing at a high level at that age.
Like
the
Preston
man doesn't age.
He's still 22 to us.
He's still 21. He's been in the league for 12 years. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, so I think that's a really interesting example because do we think that Preston's going to play till he's 35? I don't know. He's going into his contract. He's 32. He's got a $14 million cap hit, and the cap hit gets higher the next couple seasons, which I think, those escalators are kind of what you would expect with Kenny again as well. In 2025, it's a $17 million cap hit, and in 2026, it's an $18 million cap hit. But that's when they build in the things like the contract, like the bonuses. In 2024, Preston Smith gets a roster bonus of $5.4 million for making the roster. Like, I think he's going to do that. So he's just going to get his $5 million. So I think that's what we're going to see with Kenny. And I think, I don't know if Kenny's gets done before the start of the season, but it feels very Packers because it happened last time, right? To get it done either right before the season starts or right in the middle of it as things are like ramping up.
Yeah, but it's not going to happen until after Jordan.
Absolutely not. And if Jordan's deal doesn't get done before the season, we expect it to, but if it doesn't, then everything kind of gets hit with pause.
It will. Okay, last guy that I know we want to talk about before we maybe do some quick hitters is Josh Myers, because I think Josh is really interesting. He's the only other, I would say, like big free 2025 free agent, given that he was a second round pick. He's a starting offensive lineman in an offensive line that is he going to be a starter this year? Yes. Question mark, right? He's kind of fighting for his life for his next contract. So what are your thoughts on Josh? I want you to go first. I have some, but I want your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think this gets really, really interesting because I think we're having a different conversation if the Packers didn't leak out, and again, it's a rumor, we can't put a ton of truth to it, but if the leak doesn't come out that somebody in the Packers brass thinks that Zach Tom is an all-pro center, I think maybe we're talking about the center position a little bit differently. Because I think, if that doesn't come out, we're talking about Zach Tom earned the spot at right tackle, lock it up. That is what it is. Now that we're talking about, okay, they drafted Jordan Morgan, they also have Rasheed Walker, you have Zach Tom in the conversation, who also is hurt and might not be able to start the season. That kind of musical chairs rotation complicates things. But for what they expected out of Josh Myers, I almost said Josh Tom, out of Josh Myers is he delivering? And I think that's a valid question because right now, we had to do the comparisons. He's 29th in the league for centers, obviously, because he's on a rookie deal. He's making 1.3 million a year. Has like a little over 5 million as his full salary from his rookie contract, which again, to be expected. Frank Ragnow deservedly is the top paid center in the league. Now that Jason Kelce is retired, he's making $13.5 million a year. There's not a world where I would sign off on Josh Myers making $13.5 million a year. However, if you go to like the 10th-ish, like Connor Williams in Miami, he's making $7 million a year. If the Packers, because we know that the Packers are higher on Josh Myers than a lot of the fans, a lot of Pro Football Focus, if the Packers are higher on him, is $7 million in the grand scheme of things that much money when we're talking about having the rest of your offense be on a relatively cheap contract? So I think that's where it gets interesting, is where do the Packers rank him? Do they think they can get better? Is the draft good when it comes to offensive linemen? The Packers historically don't start rookies. They did with Josh, maybe out of necessity. They think he's getting better. What's his value?
It's a really interesting scale. Okay. My thoughts are, is Josh Myers the 10th best center in the league? Like, that's what we have to ask ourselves. Like, where does he rank?
Yeah.
And also, do the Packers have a better center on their roster right now where they don't need to pay Josh? I think we don't get that question, the second question answered, either question, quite frankly, answered until after this season. We need to see Josh play again, and we need to see Jacob Monk. We need to potentially see, do they want to move Zach Tom? I mean, there are just too many unanswered questions about the depth in that room to know. I also can't, Packers pay Jordan. Let's say the Packers pay Kenny. That cap space that's left, would they rather pay Josh Myers $7 million, $5 million? Let's say it's a 3-year, $5 million a year, $15 million deal right now. Would they rather use that $5 million on Josh, or would they rather use that $5 million literally anywhere else?
Literally anyone.
Let's say they are really high on Jacob Monk. They just drafted him. He's going to be cheaper by a fifth, probably, right? What's his cap? Going to be like $1 million. Same as Josh. He has the same. Let's say it's the same contract as Josh right now, 1.3. Is it worth paying Josh Myers $5 to $7 million? Probably not. Especially if they're about to do 2 huge contracts, have to do multiple other contracts in the future. You said it, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs. If they have to pay Quay Walker, if they have to pay Devontae Wyatt, cap hits on other guys are going to go up. I just think Josh Myers starts to fall in the rankings of importance, unfortunately. And they just drafted a number of depth guys who can play in the interior. They also have Elton. Do you want to move Elton from left guard? I don't know, but
it was at this exact moment that my internet died for the rest of the evening. So welcome back to the Packs As She Said podcast. Perri and I, for those listening in audio, are in different clothes. Coffee
now drinking coffee.
Yeah, what a morning. But we're here to finish out the show. Perri, you were talking about the Josh Myers contract and making some really, really good points. And then I froze. So let's just go ahead and completely circle back to that point. Rewind and then let's get there.
Sure. So for those of you listening, I was saying that I just felt like you can't only think about 2025 in a vacuum. And that you're also, if you're Russ Ball and Goot, you're probably also thinking about 2026 and like, where does Josh Myers also stack against some of the 2026 free agents in terms of like who they want to pay? And I think he also starts to fall down the totem pole in that regard. Unless, of course, he comes in this season and plays like a Pro Bowl center. You know, that's certainly in the cards. Do I foresee that happening? No, given his track record thus far, but you know, you never know what kind of development is on the horizon. So
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because what I was going to say prior to freezing and losing access to my internet was kind of along the similar vein. And when you look at a guy like Zach Tom and you know, the way that he could play anywhere on the roster, he right now is poised to get right tackle money in 2026 when he's a free agent. Right tackle money is substantially better than center money. The highest paid right tackle in the league is making $28 million a year. It's Penei Sewell. He would have to be the 9th best right tackle, to get center money. Like, that's where the centers come in. The highest paid center would be like 8th or 9th for right tackles. And, you know, I'm sure the Packers could have that conversation and they would try to make it equitable. But if I'm Zach Tom, unless I truly also think that I'm an all-pro center, like if I think my path to the Hall of Fame is playing center and not right tackle, maybe I make the switch. But if I look at these contracts and I can more than double my money playing right tackle, I'm not sure I'm so interested in potentially shifting spots, you know, like, so I don't know if that would have anything to do with it. But when we're talking about best five, there certainly is a market. And I think maybe Jordan Morgan's like, hey, I was drafted to play left tackle. I don't really want to play right guard because I know that left tackles on the offensive line are the guys that get the money. So there's that too, I guess.
there's also Elton. There's
Right.
also the Elton of it all, which is he's already gotten his big contract. He's already
Mhm.
gotten his big contract in the interior. So regardless of money, he could move. He knows the Packers are willing to pay him, right, to play in the interior, and he can play center. He was a center in college. So they have options even outside of the depth that they just drafted. Talking about even just the starters right now, they have options. So it's unfortunately, I think the cards are stacked against Josh Myers in terms of getting a second contract in Green Bay, but he's a very serviceable offensive lineman, right? He is not like, we're going to talk about maybe a few, if we think about another few free agents, like a Royce Newman, you know, he's not a liability when he's out there by any stretch of the imagination. So I fully expect that somebody out there in this league, if it's not Green Bay, is going to want to sign Josh Myers to their roster and likely start him. He is, I'm sure, an upgrade to a number of centers. I think the Packers are just in a position where they have a lot of really good potential starters on their roster that could be cheaper options.
Yeah. And just, you know, to kind of wrap that argument, looking at guard salaries, Landon Nickerson is the highest paid at around $21 million a year. Elton Jenkins is tied for 7th, averaging roughly $17 million a year. So he is,
and he reset the market when he got his
right.
contract.
Mm-hmm.
So
all right, we have obviously the list of who is coming up. Eric Stokes is in that conversation, Isaiah McDuffie, AJ Dillon's on a 1-year deal. I don't know if that's even, you know, worth mentioning at this point. That was kind of a wait and see, we think. But I think you have a really good point too about how strongly do you feel about this upcoming class, knowing that 2 years down the line is when you have some really significant decisions that you need to be considering. So that makes things tricky too. You've got Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, you mentioned Quay Walker, Devontae Wyatt. And do any of those players factor in? You know, does paying Kenny Clark inhibit you from spending too much money on a Devontae Wyatt? The Packers historically prefer to give second contracts and third contracts. So like, I would not want to be Russ Ball, I guess is what I'm saying in all of this.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. It's something that you're right, I do not envy. You know, it's why I think as fans, you look at certain decisions the Packers front office makes and you're like, I don't get it. But they don't make these decisions in a vacuum by any stretch of the imagination. You know, there's also the added caveat of both Quay and Devontae Wyatt have their 5th-year options. So you don't actually need to extend them just yet. You can just pick up the 5th-year option. and then be done with it and give themselves an extra year on those guys. We don't know if the cap is going to go up with media sales. There's that. I think the Packers did themselves a world of service by just like front loading Aaron Rodgers' dead money, because now all of that is off their books and they are going to have the cap space, but now, they're paying their quarterback. So once again, it all comes back to, what does this Jordan Love deal look like? What is the cap hit for next season? What is the cap hit going down the line? Do they front load it? Do they back load it? And what does that mean for the rest of the guys? I think, again, a lot of it comes down to, how does the team look this season? If the team this season goes to the Super Bowl, all these guys are going to be looking for a payday. If Christian Watson
deservedly so.
They're deservedly so, right. And they're going to have I don't want to use the L word, but the leverage in the market, because they're going to be desirable also by other teams, and their agents are going to know that. If Christian Watson stays healthy all season and he's the Christian Watson that we know and love, that totally changes what this contract looks like. If he's not, that totally changes if they want to bring him back or what that contract looks like. Like, there are so many variables, and we're getting very ahead of ourselves in the 2026 conversation. But I do think that 2026 is worth thinking about, like you said, when thinking about who they have to pay in 2025, because the 2025 list is small, but the 2026 list is long. And those decisions, they're going to be thinking about those decisions this coming year.
Yeah. And I mean, we've talked obviously about Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, but I think it's also worth noting, like we mentioned Zach Tom in there, Rasheed Walker, same class. Sean Ryan, same class. Sean Ryan potentially could be your starting right guard. So you're looking at potentially 3 starters on your offensive line and 2 of your top 3 wide receivers. So 5 players all needing a payday. And if all of them are starters, you can argue the weight of, significance, where maybe you desire your right tackle more than your right guard. So that money is, where you're going to spend. But yeah, this is the problem, Goot, when you have such really good draft classes, is that it doesn't get any easier. And, dividends, of course, it's too early to read the tea leaves on any of that. But then you've got Jaden Reed and Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave. So it's not going to get any easier or cheaper.
And not to put the pressure on, but I think as we're having this conversation, the more I'm thinking about it, it's like, we keep touting this team as, oh, it's so amazing that they're so young, right? They're cheap. This offense is so cheap. It's amazing. Look at what they've done with all of this young talent. Well, that window is small. That window is finite. And you have to capitalize on that window while you can, because they're not going to be able to pay everyone, and they're not going to be able to keep this team together for forever. We've seen some amazing teams, unfortunately, only get 1 season together in the Aaron Rodgers era. And it was really hard to watch, because you knew the potential was there and you knew that they could have done it and they just couldn't. And like, this league is so hard, and they're walking into this season with expectations, but I don't think lofty expectations, given they're just 1 season removed from like their first year together. But they're not far from Super Bowl expectations, especially as we're talking about this. I'm thinking like, this window of cheap contracts is small, and to build around Jordan Love while the contracts are cheap is small. So yeah, this feels like the moment.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is the argument against having a quarterback that sits for so long, right? Because as vital as it was to his development, and I'm not saying it was the wrong move, I think it was actually absolutely the right move for Jordan and the Packers and that situation. But the flip side of that, of course, is that you had a player that you drafted in 2020 that started for the first time in 2023. So that window of having all of these lesser contracts becomes much smaller and shrunken. Not to say that there's like, I still think teams should do it. I think that there's value in that development. But, now we're talking about Jordan Love getting his money, and we're also, looking at the small contracts that are only going to be small for probably another season before guys start getting paid, and rightfully so. So Any other contracts or players or things you want to look at before we wrap this one up?
No, I think this was a really fun discussion. I hope everyone
So fun
enjoyed
we did it twice. We
Yeah,
had to do it
so
2
fun
times.
we did it twice. I hope we took it in a different spin than other people did. You know, we're not numbers girls. We're not going to go in and get the spreadsheet out, but just I think there's domino effects to contract and roster building, and I think that's a really fun part of the NFL. And it's especially fun when you have a team like the Packers who currently are in a really unique position with a really young team. And we've mentioned that they've kind of put these pieces together who are on these cheap contracts. And there's going to be a lot of moving parts in trying to keep a really strong roster together. And our GM is going to have to make some really tough decisions, I imagine, in the next like 2-3 seasons around who he keeps, who he doesn't. And I think some of those decisions are going to be good ones, and some of those he might regret, right?
Yeah.
There might be a Micah Hyde decision in there somewhere that fans are going to say, why'd you do that? And you know what? It's just the name of the game. You can't keep everyone. This is not baseball. You know? So I just think it's exciting, and it's exciting because the Packers just happen to have a lot of really, really awesome talent.
Yeah. How fortunate to be in a crappy situation like the Packers will be a couple of years. But thank you to everyone for listening to the show. We are so happy that you stuck with us through everything to get this one finished because it was a lot of fun, a really good discussion. We'll be back next week with an undisclosed topic because we don't know what it is yet, but you can find the podcast at PWSS Podcast. Find us at Cheesehead TV, everywhere you listen to the audio format. Please make sure you're subscribing on YouTube. Subscribe if you don't already and like each show. It really helps us out. You can find Perri on Twitter at Perri_Goldstein. You can find me on Twitter at Maggie J. Loney. Thank you for listening, and go Pack Go.